So you want to run a Viking Age operation. First requirement: you need a ship that costs the equivalent of roughly 20 to 30 cows in trade value to build. And it still takes a full crew of 30 to 60 men, willing to risk drowning in the North Sea for a payout they won't see for months. Welcome to one of the most misunderstood economic systems in medieval history. An operation that looked like random pillaging from the outside, but ran on trade networks, tribute systems, and slave markets stretching from Newfoundland to Baghdad. What did Viking economics actually sell?
Why would a raiding operation eventually turn into the backbone of European trade? And why did the wealthiest Viking operators make more money from silver dirhams minted in Central Asia than from any raid on English soil? Getting into the raiding business required real capital. A single longship, like the ones excavated at Gokstad and Oseberg in Norway, took an estimated 20,000 to 30,000 hours of skilled labor to build using axes, adzes, and iron rivets, no saws involved, every plank split by hand along the wood grain for strength. That's before you've fed, armed, and equipped a crew of 40 men for a summer raiding season, each expecting a share of the plunder under a fairly rigid system where the ship's owner, often a local chieftain, took the largest cut off the top. You needed either inherited wealth, a successful previous raid to reinvest, or backing from a more powerful jarl willing to front the costs for a percentage of the return. This wasn't a business you walked into, it was a business you were born adjacent to, or bled your way into. If building your own fleet was too slow, there was a faster path: buy into an existing operation, or better yet, extort a standing kingdom directly. In 991 AD, after a Viking fleet defeated English forces at the Battle of Maldon, King Ethelred the Unready paid 10,000 Roman pounds of silver, roughly 3,300 kilograms, just to make the raiders leave. That was the first documented payment of what became known as Danegeld. Over the following decades, English kings paid an estimated total of 100,000 to 150,000 pounds of silver in Danegeld payments, essentially institutionalizing extortion as a recurring line item in royal accounting. Somebody in the Danish court eventually realized that showing up with a fleet was more profitable than actually fighting a battle. Funny how that math works out. Compare that to how the trade routes worked in the East. While Western Vikings, mostly Norwegian and Danish, focused on raiding and eventually settling in England, Ireland, and Normandy, the Eastern branch, the Rus, primarily Swedish in origin, built an entirely different economic model along the Volga and Dnieper river systems, trading furs, honey, amber, and enslaved people directly with the Abbasid Caliphate and Byzantine Empire. Archaeologists have recovered more than 85,000 Islamic silver dirhams on the Baltic island of Gotland alone, minted in cities like Baghdad and Samarkand, meaning a Viking trader in Sweden could be holding coins that had traveled nearly 4,000 miles overland and by river before reaching his hand. Raiding got the headlines. Trading got the money. Here's a stat that surprises people. Historians now estimate that trade, not raiding, generated the majority of Viking-era wealth, with the slave trade alone estimated to have moved tens of thousands of captured Slavic, Irish, and Anglo-Saxon people annually through hubs like Hedeby and Dublin during peak periods in the 9th and 10th centuries. The word slave in English actually derives from Slav, a direct linguistic fossil of exactly who was being sold and by whom. Vikings weren't just raiders with a side hustle in trade. They were, for large stretches of this period, essentially one of medieval Europe's largest human trafficking networks, operating in plain sight along established river routes. None of this happened without some kind of protection built into the system. The safety net here wasn't insurance in the modern sense, it was the Norse legal and kinship structure itself. The thing system, regional assemblies where free men settled disputes, and the blood feud obligation that meant killing a Viking trader or raider without cause could trigger retaliation from his entire extended family or crew. It covered personal and property disputes among free Norse people reasonably well. It covered absolutely nothing for the people being captured and sold as slaves, who had no standing in that legal system whatsoever, and it did nothing to protect Viking settlements themselves from counter-raids, which happened constantly and just got absorbed as an operating cost. So why would anyone run this operation instead of just farming? Here's the real mechanism. Scandinavian farmland was brutally limited.
with only about 3% of Norway's total land area suitable for agriculture, meaning younger sons with no inheritance rights under Norse succession customs had almost no path to wealth at home. Raiding and trading solved the exact same problem, converting military or commercial risk into land, silver, and status that the domestic economy simply couldn't provide. It wasn't cultural bloodlust. It was a population with limited arable land and abundant ships finding the only scalable business model available to them. Picture it small. A modest raid on an undefended monastery, like the 793 AD raid on Lindisfarne, might net a crew of 40 men silver reliquaries, gold altar fittings, and captives worth, in realistic period terms, somewhere around 200 to 400 silver pennies per raider once converted and divided, after the shipowner's cut. Multiply that by a single summer raiding season with 2 or 3 such targets, and a mid-tier raider could clear the equivalent of several years of farm income in a few months, assuming he survived. Now scale that up. By the mid-800s, Viking forces weren't raiding villages anymore. They were extracting tribute from entire kingdoms. The great heathen army that invaded England starting in 865 AD eventually controlled the Danelaw, an area covering roughly half of England, generating ongoing tribute, land rents, and trade tax revenue that historians estimate in the thousands of pounds of silver annually across multiple decades of occupation. That's the difference between a single smash-and-grab operation and owning an actual revenue-generating territory. Speaking of things that quietly drain your resources without you noticing, if you've ever wondered how your personal data ends up scattered across dozens of broker sites without your permission, that's basically the modern equivalent of an undefended monastery, and Incogni exists to handle the raiding party for you, automatically contacting data brokers and forcing them to delete your information before it gets sold again. The link in the description gets you 55% off an annual plan. Back to the Danelaw, because tribute was only half the business model. The second major revenue stream was the slave trade itself, run through structured markets rather than chaotic plunder. Dublin, founded by Norse settlers around 841 AD, became one of the largest slave markets in Western Europe, with historical estimates suggesting the Dublin slave trade moved captives numbering in the thousands annually at its height in the 10th century, sold onward to Iberia and even into markets controlled by the Umayyad Caliphate in Spain. A single healthy captive could fetch the equivalent of several ounces of silver, meaning one successful raiding trip that captured 20 to 30 people could out-earn an entire season of monastery raids combined. This wasn't incidental to Viking economics. For roughly 2 centuries, it was arguably the core product. Now the scandal. In 1002 AD, King Ethelred, having paid Danegeld multiple times and apparently deciding extortion payments weren't buying him enough peace, ordered what became known as the St. Brice's Day Massacre, a mass killing of Danish settlers living in England, reportedly including Gunhilda, sister of Danish King Sweyn Forkbeard. The financial and political fallout was catastrophic. Sweyn Forkbeard invaded England in retaliation, and by 1013 had conquered the entire kingdom, briefly making England a Danish possession. Ethelred fled to Normandy. Nobody paid a fine. Nobody went to prison. The guy who ordered a massacre to save money on tribute payments ended up losing the entire country instead. Efficient. Then came the real collapse of the system, and it took less than a single day to demonstrate exactly how fragile Viking-era wealth extraction had become. On September 25, 1066, at the Battle of Stamford Bridge, the Norwegian king Harald Hardrada, one of the most successful and wealthy Viking tradition rulers in history, having previously served as a mercenary commander for the Byzantine Varangian Guard and accumulated a personal fortune historians estimate in the tens of thousands of silver marks, led an invasion force into northern England, expecting the kind of quick, decisive victory that had worked for Viking-descended rulers for 2 centuries. English King Harold Godwinson, instead of negotiating or paying tribute, marched his army 185 miles in 4 days to catch Hardrada's forces by surprise, many of Hardrada's men not even wearing their armor because they'd been told the English wouldn't arrive that fast. Hardrada was killed by an arrow to the throat. His invasion fleet of roughly 300 ships was reduced to 24 for the retreat home. 3 weeks later, Harold Godwinson himself died at the Battle of Hastings against William the Conqueror, meaning the entire economic and military model that had defined Viking-era Europe for 250 years effectively ended within a single month, September into October of 1066. Pull the lessons out of that collapse. First, an economic system built on the assumption that your opponents won't adapt eventually meets an opponent who adapts, and Stamford Bridge proved English forces had gotten faster, better organized, and less willing to simply pay their way out of a raid. Second, personal fortune doesn't protect you from strategic miscalculation. Hardrada had more silver and more battlefield experience than almost anyone alive in 1066, and none of it mattered against an army that arrived a day earlier than expected. Third, extraction-based economies are fragile in a way trade-based economies aren't, because tribute and plunder require continuous military dominance, while trade routes like the Volga system kept generating wealth for Swedish merchants for another 2 centuries after the raiding economy collapsed in the West. Here's the insider stat that reframes the whole era. Modern archaeological analysis of Viking Age burial goods suggests the wealthiest Norse graves, by silver and trade good volume, belonged overwhelmingly to merchants and landholders on the eastern routes through Russia, not to raiders in the West, meaning the warrior-raider image driving most popular culture is actually the smaller, less profitable side of the operation, compared to the quieter river trading network most people have never heard of. Zoom out, and the structural truth is this. The Viking Age functioned as a 2-track economy, a violent extraction model in the West that generated fast but unstable wealth through raiding and tribute, and a patient trade network model in the East that generated slower but far more durable wealth through furs, silver, and human trafficking along river systems connecting Scandinavia to the Islamic world, and the raiding got remembered because burning monasteries makes better chronicles than moving furs down a river. So what did actually running a piece of the Viking economy look like in real numbers? Small scale. A single ship's crew running 2 or 3 raids per season might generate the equivalent of 300 to 500 silver pennies per crew member after the owner's cut, against outfitting costs of maybe 50 to 80 pennies per man, netting a modest but real seasonal profit, enough to buy land or livestock back home if you survived multiple seasons. Large scale. A Rus trading operation running the Volga route with a fleet of merchant vessels, moving furs, amber, and captives to Abbasid markets, could generate the equivalent of thousands of silver dirhams annually, against travel, toll, and security costs, eating maybe a third of gross revenue, netting a merchant family serious multi-generational wealth, the kind reflected in those 85,000 coins still turning up in Gotland's soil 1,000 years later. So yes, you could run a Viking Age operation. Just remember, the ship is the overhead, the silver dirhams are the real business model, and the guys with axes burning monasteries were doing the marketing, while the guys quietly rowing furs down a Russian river were doing the actual accounting.